Long before it became a symbol of preservation and royal vision, the land we now know as Dumfries House was simply part of the ancient Scottish landscape, a gentle, rolling stretch of Ayrshire, veined with streams and layered with history older than any map could trace. It wasn't yet a house. It didn't yet dream of Chippendale chairs, Palladian windows, or corridors filled with silent elegance. But even then, it had something, a sense of place, a gravitational pull for those who passed through. This was Lefnorice, later called Loch Norris, a name whispered in the folds of local lore and tucked between the stories of lesser-known noble families. High on a rise overlooking the future carriageways and gardens stood a modest stronghold, part castle, part manor, owned by a lesser branch of the Crawfords of Loudoun. Its walls were thick, built for defence more than for beauty, and its windows looked out not on sweeping vistas but on the possibility of danger. It was a different kind of time, and the architecture reflected it. Functional, restrained, and above all, temporary. Though the original structure would not survive the centuries, its foundation would linger beneath the surface like a ghost blueprint, waiting to be overwritten by something far more ambitious. Yet even in its early form, the estate revealed a curious duality. While it stood firm as a family seat, it was surrounded by nature far more expressive than its own stone silhouette. There were broad fields that shimmered with wind, pockets of woodland humming with life, and an unspoken dialogue between the built and the wild. There are places where history feels heavy and unmoving, as if trapped in the past. But Loch Norris was not one of them. It had motion. It anticipated change. What brought about that change was not battle or disaster, but acquisition. In the mid-17th century, the Crawfords parted ways with the estate, and it passed into the hands of William Crichton, the second Earl of Dumfries. The transfer was not merely transactional, it was generational. With the Crichtons came a different kind of ambition, one rooted not in survival, but in legacy. They didn't want to hold the land. They wanted to shape it, define it, leave their imprint on it, not through walls of defence, but through architecture of elegance. Still, for decades after the purchase, the landscape remained relatively untouched by grand gestures. The old buildings endured, aging into obsolescence, as if reluctant to admit they were no longer needed. Time moved slowly, but it moved nonetheless. The grounds began to whisper of potential. It wasn't just a plot of land anymore, it was the outline of a future house that hadn't been imagined yet, but would soon demand to be built. What's remarkable is not just that Dumfries House eventually rose from this soil, but that everything about the land, its elevation, its view, even its remoteness, seemed perfectly staged for it long before the first stone was set, as if the earth had been holding its breath, waiting for the moment when design and purpose would finally meet, waiting for the house to arrive. The Crichton family may have acquired the land in the 1600s, but it would take nearly a century for their vision to fully materialize. In the meantime, life on the estate was marked by quiet continuity. The older buildings, still rooted in their defensive past, remained the primary residence, simple, serviceable, and increasingly inadequate. They echoed an older way of living, one focused on survival and duty rather than refinement or expression. The stone walls, once symbols of power, began to feel more like limitations than legacies. The world beyond was changing. And the house, or rather what passed for it, was not. Throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, the Scottish aristocracy was undergoing a transformation. Power was no longer asserted solely through lineage or landholding. It was being reshaped through aesthetics, taste, and the ability to project an image of modernity. Across the lowlands, noble families were turning to architecture not just to shelter their lives, but to define them. Homes became declarations, and style became strategy. The rising tide of neoclassicism, imported from Italy and translated into British forms by architects like Inigo Jones and Colin Campbell, was altering the very idea of what a country house could and should be. Against this backdrop, the estate at Loch Norris began to feel frozen in time. The once practical buildings were now relics, out of sync with the cultural momentum of the era. Visitors might have appreciated the setting, its meadows, woods, and peaceful remove, But the structures themselves no longer inspired admiration. There was no drama in their lines, no story in their symmetry. And for a family whose title carried increasing weight in Scottish and British nobility, that absence was becoming glaring. The turning point came with William Dalrymple Crichton, heir to both the earldom of Dumfries and the earldom of Stair. Born into a hybrid legacy of two influential families, he inherited not just land, but the pressure to rise to the expectations of a changing age. The existing house wasn't merely old-fashioned, it was a missed opportunity. It lacked the proportions, the theatricality, the deliberate geometry that had come to define aristocratic ambition. It couldn't host dignitaries with pride, nor reflect the kind of cultivated worldview that men like Dalrymple Crichton now aspired to, but there was another, more personal motive. Architecture, in the mid-18th century, had become a way to shape how future generations would remember you. Estates were no longer just residences, they were monuments. A house built in the right style, by the right architects, furnished by the right craftsman. Such a house could outlive its builder and transform a family name into a legacy. The old structures on the estate couldn't do that. They spoke of the past. Dalrymple Crichton wanted something that would speak to posterity. The decision to replace the existing buildings wasn't made lightly. It meant erasing centuries of quiet history, clearing away the old to make room for a vision that hadn't yet been fully formed. But the time was right. Britain was entering an age of enlightenment, of design governed by reason, and of beauty shaped by classical ideals. What Loch Norris needed wasn't another renovation. It needed reinvention. Thus, before a single drawing was made, before the name Dumfries House had been chosen, the idea was planted. A house that wouldn't just shelter a family, but announce them. A house that would become a stage, a symbol, a statement of permanence in a world starting to embrace impermanence. The Palladian dream hadn't yet arrived, but the ground was being cleared in every sense to receive it. William Dalrymple Crichton did not inherit the estate at a moment of comfort or calm. By the time he fully assumed his titles and responsibilities, Britain was standing at a crossroads between inherited tradition and deliberate reinvention. Ideas were moving faster than stone, taste was becoming a form of language, and the aristocracy was increasingly judged not only by lineage, but by how convincingly it could present itself as modern, cultivated, and forward-looking. For Dalrymple Crichton, the estate was no longer just land passed down through generations. It was a test. He was acutely aware that the house standing on his land spoke the wrong dialect of history. It belonged to an era defined by caution and enclosure, not confidence and display. Thick walls and irregular forms once signalled strength, but now they suggested stagnation. To live in such a building was to live inside someone else's century. Dalrymple Crichton did not want to adjust the past. He wanted to declare the present. This distinction mattered. Many landowners chose the safer path. Extensions, cosmetic updates, partial redesigns that preserved the core while softening its edges. Dalrymple Crichton rejected that approach entirely. To renovate would be to compromise, to allow the old structure to dictate the terms of the new vision. He understood that architecture, like power, is most persuasive when it is coherent. A house assembled from different eras rarely speaks clearly. It hesitates. He wanted certainty. Starting from nothing was a radical decision, but also a calculated one. A new house could be planned as a complete system, proportions aligned from the first stone, views choreographed from every window, interiors conceived as part of a unified whole, rather than as rooms accumulated over time. This was architecture as authorship, and Dalrymple Crichton intended to be its patron, not its caretaker. There was also an unmistakable element of competition. Across Britain, peers were commissioning houses that embodied the ideals of balance, order, and classical restraint. These buildings were not just admired, they were discussed, visited, and remembered. To fall behind was to fade quietly into irrelevance. Dalrymple Crichton wanted a house that could hold its own in conversation with the finest estates of the age, not through excess, but through precision. Equally important was how the house would function socially. The old residence imposed limits. Its rooms were ill-suited for large gatherings, its circulation awkward, its hierarchy unclear. A new house could be designed to manage movement, to guide guests through a narrative of arrival, anticipation and revelation. In the 18th century, this mattered deeply. Hospitality was performance, and the house was the stage. The decision once made became irreversible. Clearing the site meant acknowledging that continuity would be broken, that the past would not gently evolve into the future, but be deliberately replaced. Yet Dalrymple Crichton did not see this as erasure. He saw it as translation. The values of permanence, dignity, and authority would remain, but they would be expressed in a new architectural language, one that matched the intellectual climate of the time. By choosing to build anew, he aligned himself with a generation that believed reason could shape beauty, and that beauty could shape society. The house he imagined would not merely reflect who he was, but who he believed the age itself was becoming. The land was ready. The intention was clear. All that remained was to find the minds capable of giving that intention form. Choosing architects in the mid-18th century was not a technical decision. It was a declaration of intent. William Dalrymple Crichton was not looking for builders who could simply produce a respectable country house. He needed interpreters, men capable of translating ambition, taste, and authority into stone. The house he envisioned had to speak, and not in whispers. It had to announce itself as modern, measured, and intellectually confident. For that, he turned to John Adam and Robert Adam, at a moment when their own careers were poised on the edge of transformation. The Adam brothers were heirs to a formidable architectural legacy. Their father, William Adam, had dominated Scottish architecture for decades, shaping an entire generation of estates with a robust, confident style rooted in Palladian principles. After his passing in 1748, the brothers inherited not only his practice, but the expectation that they would either repeat his language or surpass it. Dumfries House offered them something rare, a clean slate, a patron willing to trust them, and the freedom to define what the next phase of Scottish architecture might look like. John Adam, the elder brother, brought experience and restraint. He understood proportion instinctively and knew how to balance grandeur with discipline. Robert Adam, younger and more restless, contributed imagination and intellectual curiosity. Though he would soon depart on his formative grand tour of Europe, his influence was already present in the conceptual ambition of the project. Together, they approached Dumfries House not as a single object, but as a complete composition. Architecture as narrative rather than accumulation. From the outset, the design rejected excess. This was not to be a house that overwhelmed through scale or ornament. Instead, it would persuade through harmony. The Palladian model provided the foundation, a central block asserting calm authority, flanked by smaller pavilions connected through elegant wings. Every element had a role, every line a purpose. The building was meant to be read as a whole, not admired in fragments. What made the project distinctive was the way exterior and interior were conceived simultaneously. The Adams were not content with facades that impressed at a distance, but dissolved into confusion once crossed. Inside, rooms were proportioned to echo the logic of the exterior, creating a seamless experience as one moved through the house. Sightlines were deliberate, transitions were choreographed. The house guided its occupants without drawing attention to the guidance itself. This coherence was radical. Many houses of the period evolved over decades, absorbing tastes and compromises along the way. Dumfries House was different. It was planned, executed, and completed within a narrow window of time, preserving the integrity of the original vision. That unity would later become one of its most remarkable qualities, a rare survival of 18th century intent, unblurred by later fashions. The Adams also understood symbolism. The house was not defensive, nor was it theatrical. Its authority came from balance, from the quiet confidence of classical proportion. In an era fascinated by reason, symmetry became a moral language. Dumfries House did not shout wealth, it demonstrated control. It suggested that its owner belonged to a world governed by order rather than impulse. Even the relationship between the house and its surroundings was carefully considered. The building was positioned not to dominate the landscape, but to converse with it. Views outward were framed, not forced. Approaches were designed to unfold gradually, allowing anticipation to build before the full facade revealed itself. Arrival became an experience rather than a moment. In commissioning the Adam brothers, Dalrymple Crichton aligned himself with a new architectural philosophy, one that treated buildings as arguments, not ornaments. Dumfries House was intended to express an idea that modern aristocratic power could be elegant, rational, and enduring. The architects understood this implicitly, and in stone, proportion, and restraint, they allowed the house to begin speaking its language, quietly, clearly, and with lasting authority. The 1750s arrived not with fanfare, but with focus. While political tensions stirred across Europe and intellectual revolutions brewed in salons and universities, something quieter but no less ambitious was unfolding in the heart of Ayrshire. On the gentle rise once occupied by older stone, the first foundations of Dumfries House were laid. What followed was not just construction, it was precision work, a kind of architectural performance unfolding in real time, where every detail had been imagined before the first tool met the ground. Building a house of this scale was never simple, but the project at Dumfries was unusually disciplined. Most country estates evolved in stages. Plans changed, owners wavered, architects adjusted. But here, the clarity of vision was unwavering. The design set forth by John and Robert Adam remained consistent, executed with a loyalty to its original proportions that would become one of the house's most remarkable legacies. There were, of course, choices made on the ground, but they were refinements rather than revisions, decisions about texture, rhythm, and materiality rather than shape or message. Local masons and craftsmen brought the plans to life with a quiet rigour. Among them was James Armour, a name that would later echo in literary history as the father-in-law of Robert Burns, but in these years he was simply a master mason whose stonework helped define the structure's crisp lines and enduring silhouette. His work didn't seek to impress through embellishment. It was about consistency, weight, and timelessness. In every joint and angle, the building asserted a commitment to craftsmanship that matched its architectural logic. One of the most striking aspects of the project was its pace. The house was constructed between 1754 and 1759, a remarkably efficient timeline for a project of such scale and ambition. There were no costly halts, no dramatic rethinks. This was possible not only because of the careful planning, but also because the patron, the architects, and the builders were unusually aligned in purpose. Everyone knew what they were making and why it mattered. The interiors, too, were conceived during this intense period of realization. Instead of being filled over time, room by room, with accumulated taste, Dumfries House was furnished from the beginning with a sense of unity. A commission was placed with none other than Thomas Chippendale, the celebrated cabinet maker whose name was already synonymous with elegance and restraint. His pieces were designed to echo the architecture itself, measured, proportioned, and made to last. This furniture wasn't chosen, it was composed. Inside and out, the house took shape as a whole. The central block rose first, its 3 stories articulated with confident rhythm, its windows calculated to balance light and geometry. Flanking wings followed, linking to the smaller pavilions with deliberate grace. Nothing jutted or jarred. The architecture moved like music, each part in harmony with the next. The landscape, too, was beginning to respond to the house's new presence. While formal gardens would come later, the positioning of the structure had already begun to define sightlines, frame vistas, and hint at an emerging dialogue between built form and natural expanse. The house did not impose. It settled. It belonged, as if it had always waited to be here. And perhaps most remarkably, once the house was completed, it remained untouched for generations. Unlike so many great estates which were altered, enlarged, or improved in later centuries, Dumfries House stood largely as it had been designed. No Victorian wings, no Edwardian overhauls. It escaped the fate of fashion. What was built in the 1750s endured not just physically but conceptually. This purity wasn't accidental. It was the result of conviction on the part of a patron who knew what he wanted, architects who knew how to deliver it, and craftsmen who gave it form. Dumfries House became not just a home, but a statement captured in stone and silence. A rare alignment of people, vision, and moment in time, when a building could be more than shelter. It could be truth. To step inside Dumfries House is not simply to enter a building. It is to cross a threshold into another century, a space where the air itself seems to hold the memory of intent, where every wall, every furnishing, every finely carved cornice seems to echo a quiet agreement made long ago. That beauty, when shaped with care and purpose, can resist the erosion of time. From the moment the front door opens, the house reveals itself not in grandeur, but in harmony. There is no single dominant room, no theatrical gesture meant to overwhelm. Instead, what unfolds is a sequence of spaces, each proportioned not only to the human body but to the rhythm of the house itself. This internal order was no accident. It was a conscious act of design, carried out by minds that understood that true elegance lies not in excess, but in cohesion. The interiors were conceived at the same time as the architecture. This rare simultaneity allowed for a unity of vision that few houses of the era could claim. Nothing was improvised. Walls were built with the furniture in mind. Ceilings were measured to accommodate the precise scale of chandeliers. Windows were placed not only to illuminate rooms, but to reflect the polished surfaces within. Even the transitions between rooms were designed with intention. Doorways aligned so that light and symmetry carried from one space to the next in a continuous visual logic. At the heart of this interior world is the extraordinary collection of original furnishings, many of which were specially commissioned from Thomas Chippendale, already a name of reverence in the mid-18th century. His workshop in London delivered pieces that were not merely decorative, but architectural in their own right. Sideboards, writing desks, cabinets, all were tailored to the specific dimensions and tones of the rooms they were destined for. It was as if the furniture had grown from the walls themselves. The materials used, rich mahogany, rosewood, satinwood, spoke of confidence, not ostentation. The carvings were precise, the lines clean, the ornament restrained. Chippendale's genius lay in creating objects that didn't demand attention but rewarded it. A viewer could pass through the house a dozen times and still discover new flourishes of craftsmanship hidden in a chair leg or the inlay of a cabinet door. But what makes Dumfries House exceptional is not simply the quality of these objects, it is their survival. Where most historic estates lost their original contents to time, inheritance battles, or fashionable updates, Dumfries House remained almost miraculously intact. Its interiors today remain close to what they were in the 1760s, an unbroken ensemble of architecture and design, preserved not behind velvet ropes but as a living, breathing whole. Every room tells a different story, yet each is part of a shared vocabulary. The drawing room glows with warmth and light, softened by plasterwork ceilings and damask walls. The library feels quieter, more contemplative, its shelves lined with volumes that have watched centuries unfold. Upstairs, bedrooms maintain their refined simplicity, free from clutter, their furniture still arranged as if awaiting the return of a long-departed guest. Time, it seems, does not move the same way within these walls. While the world outside changed its pace, abandoned its styles, and moved on to newer expressions of comfort and luxury, Dumfries House held still, and in doing so, it became something rare, a place where the past wasn't reconstructed, it was never lost. This internal continuity gave the house a kind of stillness, but not sterility. It wasn't a museum, it was, and remains, a place made for living, just not living at modern speed. The craftsmanship, the scale, the materials, all invite a slowing down, a deep breath, a moment of recognition that beauty can be both immediate and enduring. In that sense, the inner world of Dumfries House is not just a testament to the past. It is a quiet provocation to the present. It asks whether we still know how to build things that last, not just physically but emotionally. It suggests that permanence isn't a question of stone, but of vision. And in every room, on every surface, the house answers its own question with astonishing clarity. Once the final stone was laid and the last piece of Chippendale furniture set in place, Dumfries House entered a chapter of its life that few great estates are ever permitted to enjoy, a long, undisturbed stillness. Not the stillness of neglect or abandonment, but of quiet stability. It was a house that had achieved exactly what it set out to be, and for generations it did not need to prove anything further. It simply existed with dignity, rhythm, and patience, allowing time to move around it rather than through it. The 18th century gave way to the 19th, and yet Dumfries House changed very little. Where other country homes fell to the temptations of fashion, adding Gothic wings, painting over frescoes, replacing wood panelling with Victorian wallpaper, this house remained remarkably untouched. It did not resist progress out of stubbornness, but because its design left so little room for improvement. Its beauty was complete from the beginning, and the generations that followed seemed to understand the rare gift they had inherited. It passed from one caretaker to the next, not as an empty shell to be reinvented, but as a living organism, still breathing with the ideas of its creators. Each owner walked the same halls, opened the same doors, looked out across the same Ayrshire fields from the same windows. The furniture wasn't moved often. The walls weren't reimagined. Life simply continued, paced by the seasons, punctuated by visitors, framed by routines that felt timeless. Outside, the landscape matured. Trees planted during the early years of the estate's rebirth grew taller, their shadows stretching across the same gravel paths walked by the house's original builders. The meadows continued to roll gently toward the horizon, dotted with livestock and edged with wildflowers that returned year after year without ever needing invitation. Inside, the house absorbed memory like a sponge. Not dramatic events, there were no royal intrigues, no public scandals, but the subtler weight of generations passing through. Children grew up beneath its painted ceilings. Fires crackled in the same hearths through winters thick with snow. Guests left faint traces in guest books and fading upholstery, and through it all, the house remained what it always had been, precise, balanced, deeply human in scale, and curiously intimate despite its grandeur. Perhaps that was its greatest strength. Unlike other stately homes designed to impress from a distance, Dumfries House welcomed closeness. Its rooms were not vast echo chambers. They were meant to be lived in, walked through slowly, appreciated by lamplight as much as daylight. It never tried to be a palace. It was always a home. And yet, within that domestic calm, something rare was happening. While the world outside shifted, empires rising and falling, fashions changing with each decade, this house was becoming something stronger than just a residence. It was becoming a record, a capsule of an idea perfectly realized and never dismantled. A place where architecture, craftsmanship, and continuity had settled into harmony. Not every generation fully understood what they were preserving. Some simply let it be, preferring quiet preservation over active celebration. But even that passivity was a kind of respect. They didn't tear down walls, they didn't strip out the past to make room for the present. Instead, they did something far more difficult. They listened, and the house in return continued to speak. Softly, steadily, never demanding, always present. There were no grand renovations, no sweeping reconstructions, only the slow accumulation of years, of footsteps, of quiet mornings and long evenings. Dumfries House learned to live in silence, but it was never mute. Its voice was simply tuned to a frequency that didn't need to shout. And so, for nearly 2 centuries, the house stood in its original form, a rare anchor in a world obsessed with reinvention. It was not frozen in time. It was flowing with it, gently, like a river too calm to ripple. It carried its story not in episodes, but in constancy. A house that didn't need to change to stay alive. A house that lived by staying still. In 1814, Dumfries House quietly crossed a threshold, not of architecture, but of inheritance. With the passing of titles and lands, it became the property of a new lineage, the Crichton-Stewart family, more widely recognised by their noble title, the Marquesses of Bute. The transition might have been a moment of rupture in another house's story, especially one as carefully composed as Dumfries House. Yet here, remarkably, the change of hands did not fracture the architectural silence, it merely adjusted the volume. If anything, the arrival of the Butes ushered in an era of subtle stewardship, a slow and thoughtful continuation of what had been so elegantly begun. The Crichton Stewarts were not strangers to grandeur. Their principal seat was Mount Stewart on the Isle of Bute, a sprawling neo-Gothic marvel dense with ornament and ambition. But their approach to Dumfries House was entirely different. They did not attempt to overwrite its identity or impose the architectural fashions of the day. Instead, they treated it as one might an antique instrument, tuning it occasionally, cleaning it with care, but never altering the shape of its sound. The third Marquess of Bute, known for his deep interests in history, theology, and the arts, could have easily chosen to remake the estate in his image. He had the means, the architects, and the vision. But when he did commission changes at Dumfries House, they were minimal, most notably asking Robert Weir Schultz, a respected architect of the arts and crafts movement, to redesign the estate's pavilions in 1885. Schultz's work, however, did not clash with the Adam legacy. It complemented it with a delicacy rare among Victorian interventions. His additions whispered rather than proclaimed, enhancing the estate without disrupting its visual grammar. These adjustments were few and measured. There were no marble staircases added, no ostentatious wings stretching across the lawn. The house remained nearly untouched in layout and tone. This restraint was not due to indifference. It was rooted in a kind of reverence. The Butes recognized that what they had inherited was not a blank canvas, but a complete composition, one where any careless addition might break the harmony. Life in the house continued as it had before, only now within a broader aristocratic network. It became a seasonal residence, a quieter branch of a larger family tree. Weddings were hosted here, guests entertained, and children raised under the same ceilings that had sheltered earlier generations. It became, in a sense, even more domesticated, less a stage for public display, more a retreat of private rituals. In the 20th century, as the tides of modernity began to erode the foundations of many great estates, Dumfries House again benefited from quiet luck. It passed into the hands of those who believed in preservation through patience. Lady Eileen, the Dowager Marchioness of Bute, lived here for much of her later life. She did not modernize aggressively, nor did she treat the house as a relic. She simply lived within it, allowing the past to remain visible without becoming untouchable. This continuity, slow, intentional, deeply respectful, is what allowed Dumfries House to arrive in the 21st century almost intact. While other houses of its era were broken up, divided, redecorated beyond recognition, or stripped of their collections, this one retained its equilibrium. It was neither a museum nor a memory. It was a place still tethered to the rhythms of real life, even as those rhythms changed. What the Butes offered Dumfries House was rare. Not transformation, but stewardship. They understood that some legacies require protection, not reinvention. Their interventions were minimal not because they lacked imagination, but because they possessed restraint, a quality as architectural as any column or cornice. And so, decade by decade, the house absorbed this quiet guardianship. It did not chase relevance. It did not attempt to evolve with each passing trend. Instead, it stood still and endured. The slow adjustments made by the Butes became part of the building's palimpsest, a fine line of new ink beneath layers of original thought. And if you walk the halls today, those traces are still there, subtle echoes of a family that chose not to build something new, but to protect something already close to perfect. As the 20th century unfolded, Dumfries House found itself in unfamiliar territory. For over 150 years, it had been protected not by walls, but by continuity, anchored by owners who valued stillness over spectacle, who respected the original vision and resisted the churn of architectural fashion. But time, unlike people, has no sentiment, and in the quiet decades of the new century, time became something more insidious than neglect. It became a threat, not through sudden destruction, but through slow invisibility. The grand houses of Britain were beginning to lose their place in the world. The old aristocratic structures, social, financial, and political, were dissolving. The world was moving faster, and with it came new definitions of status, power, and necessity. Estates once held as the symbols of legacy now looked, to many, like burdens, too costly to maintain, too large to modernize, too far removed from the rhythms of a changing nation. Dumfries House, with all its grace and restraint, was not immune. It still stood, stately and symmetrical, its Adam lines untouched, its Chippendale interiors breathing softly in the filtered light. But it had grown quiet, too quiet. The grand dinners became fewer, the parties more modest. Servants left and were not replaced. Rooms that once hummed with seasonal energy began to echo instead. The stillness that had once been its strength now risked tipping into silence. Financial pressures mounted, slowly at first, then with more urgency. The upkeep of a house built to 18th century standards, with its delicate woodwork, its hand-carved mouldings, its antique fabrics and original fixtures, required not just attention, but capital, and capital was growing scarce. Land taxes increased. Agricultural revenues declined. The old model of generational wealth sustaining country estates began to falter, and even the most responsible owners were caught in the tightening grip of economic reality. The Butes continued to care for the house, but choices had to be made. Non-essential areas were closed off, repairs were postponed, decorative projects were shelved. At no point was there a dramatic collapse, no roof caving in, no dramatic sale of contents, but rather a quiet erosion of possibility. Maintaining the house became an exercise in compromise, and with each passing year the house became less of a home and more of a question. What happens to a building when its purpose begins to fade? The answer at first was continuity in miniature. Lady Eileen, Dowager Marchioness of Bute, continued to live at Dumfries House through much of the 20th century, occupying a limited number of rooms, preserving the interior not by strategy, but by simply not disturbing it. Her presence kept the house anchored, but when she passed in the early 1990s, the question returned with renewed urgency. Her grandson, John Bute, known to the public as Johnny Dumfries, a Le Mans-winning race car driver, became the new custodian. Charismatic and private, he represented a different kind of aristocracy, fast-paced, media-aware, shaped by a world in which historic estates no longer guaranteed cultural capital. Inheriting Dumfries House also meant inheriting significant financial obligations, particularly double inheritance taxes, following the near-simultaneous loss of both grandmother and father. The weight of tradition, once worn like a badge, now pressed more like a chain. There were conversations, appraisals, letters, proposals. Could the house be sold? Could the furniture be auctioned? Could the past, beautifully preserved as it was, be parcelled out to fund the future? The temptation was strong, not out of disregard, but out of necessity. The National Trust was approached more than once, but negotiations failed. Market forces whispered alternatives, private buyers, corporate retreats, or even abandonment. The art world stirred. Chippendale's masterpieces inside the house were now more valuable individually than the estate itself. A single rosewood bookcase alone was worth several £1,000,000. The logic of fragmentation, of breaking the whole to maximise its parts, loomed larger with each year. And yet the house remained whole, if only barely. It endured in limbo, too important to be ignored, too heavy to be carried. Its survival now depended not just on admiration, but on intervention, on someone, somewhere, deciding that preservation wasn't just a romantic gesture, but a cultural responsibility. The 20th century had not broken Dumfries House. It had done something more dangerous. It had made it disappear from the centre of life. The building had not decayed. It had drifted. And as it drifted, the risk was not collapse, but forgetfulness, that this house, so carefully conceived, so lovingly maintained, might become another beautiful echo lost to time. But time, though it threatens, does not always win. Sometimes history offers a second act, and for Dumfries House that moment was fast approaching, an unexpected turn in its long, silent story. The final years before the turning point felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Dumfries House, so quietly resilient for over 2 centuries, was now vulnerable in a way it had never been before. Not because it had crumbled, not because time had torn it apart, but because the world around it no longer knew what to do with a house like this. And the question that had haunted its walls throughout the 20th century could no longer be postponed. Could it survive intact, or would it have to be broken to survive at all? By the early 2000s, the pressure was impossible to ignore. The cost of maintaining the estate had outpaced the financial means of its owner, John Bute. He wasn't indifferent. On the contrary, he knew exactly what the house represented. But knowledge did not pay taxes, and emotion did not fund restoration. 2 inheritances, his father's and grandmother's, had brought with them a staggering tax bill. Something had to give, and so, after years of delay and dwindling options, the unthinkable was put on the table. The house would be sold. At first, the hope was for a graceful transition. Discussions resumed with heritage bodies like the National Trust for Scotland, but again, no agreement was reached. The clock was ticking, and the maintenance backlog was growing. The idea of preserving Dumfries House as a whole, a unified architectural and decorative ensemble, was looking increasingly unrealistic. The fallback plan was brutally simple: separate the contents from the structure, auction the furnishings, sell the house as an empty shell, let the market decide what it would become. The implications were devastating. To anyone who understood the house not just as architecture, but as a complete cultural artifact, this was no ordinary sale. Dumfries House had survived precisely because its interiors had never been gutted, never been refashioned. The Adam-designed structure, paired with its original Chippendale furnishings, was not just rare, it was unique. One of the few places where the 18th century still lived, undisturbed in full dimension. Once those objects left, that magic would vanish. A painting here, a chair there, it wouldn't matter how careful the new owners were. The spell would break. The rooms would no longer breathe the same rhythm. The house would lose its voice. The auction houses began preparing. Christie's was enlisted to oversee the sale of the interior treasures. Catalogues were drafted. Valuations were issued. A single bookcase was estimated between $2 and $4 million. In total, the sale of the contents was expected to eclipse the value of the house itself. The logic of economics, cold and persuasive, was poised to overpower the poetry of preservation. Meanwhile, the estate agents at Savills prepared the house for the property market. There was no shortage of buyers interested in acquiring a historic shell. It could be turned into a hotel, a private retreat, an event venue. Anything, really, except what it had always been, a coherent expression of a singular moment in architectural and decorative history. The public began to stir. Heritage groups, historians, and conservationists saw what was coming. Some attempted to raise funds, others petitioned for intervention. A campaign coalesced under Save Britain's Heritage, with plans to acquire the estate and hold it in trust. But despite the passion and publicity, their efforts fell short. And when Historic Scotland, the national body, announced it would not provide funding, it seemed the final lifeline had been cut. Behind the scenes, trucks were on standby. Packing crates were being labelled. The house, so long a sanctuary of continuity, stood on the brink of fragmentation. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, but something worse, a surgical disassembly. One where the rooms would remain, but without their soul. One where the past would no longer be experienced, only imagined. And yet, even in that moment of looming loss, Dumfries House remained composed. The walls held, the floors didn't creak. The furnishings still sat in silence, waiting, not knowing that the next footsteps they heard might be the last ones to ever see the house whole. It was, in every sense, the moment before the fall, a fragile pause where history could still go either way. And in that pause, something unexpected was about to happen. Something that would shift the house's trajectory not just for a decade, but perhaps for a century to come. The spring of 2007 arrived at Dumfries House, not with blossoming hope, but with an eerie sense of countdown. There were no visible cracks in the walls, no scaffolding or collapsing roofs, and yet something vital within the estate was already beginning to unravel. In many ways, this was the most dangerous chapter in the house's long existence, not because of fire, war, or neglect, but because of bureaucracy, inevitability, and silence. It was the quiet before dismantlement, and it felt final. The plans for the auction had solidified. Christie's was ready. The date was set. The cataloguing process, painstaking, clinical, had begun room by room, object by object. Experts moved through the halls not as guests but as evaluators, measuring centuries-old furniture against a market that spoke in currency, not craftsmanship. Each object that had once been chosen to belong within a specific architectural rhythm was now being assigned a price tag and a packing label. Desks that had sat undisturbed since the 18th century were opened and inspected under harsh white light. Chairs once admired for their placement were now photographed in isolation, ready to be pulled from the rooms they had completed for over 200 years. One by one, the treasures of Dumfries House were being prepared for departure. The Chippendale bookcases, the rosewood cabinets, the delicately carved sideboards, all of them had become commodities. Even the lesser-known pieces, modest in scale but bound to the house by decades of quiet service, were included. There was no hierarchy in this process. Every item was vulnerable, and so the very identity of the house, its furniture, its palette, its sense of equilibrium, was being dissolved in advance, as if the sale had already occurred in spirit, if not yet in action. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was thick with contradiction. The staff, many of whom had cared for the house across generations, moved about their duties with mechanical efficiency, knowing that each task might be one of the last. There was an unspoken grief in every corridor, a tension that made silence louder than words. It wasn't just the removal of objects, it was the removal of meaning. A table carried out through the front door wasn't just a piece of wood, it was a chapter. And now those chapters were being loaded into trucks bound for London showrooms, far removed from the rooms they once completed. The estate itself remained physically still. The gravel drives were immaculate, the lawns freshly trimmed. From a distance, nothing looked unusual. But inside, the future was already being disassembled. The packing crates multiplied. Doors once casually left open now stood closed to prevent damage during handling. And through it all, the walls, themselves witnesses to generations, stood motionless, as if holding their breath. There was a sense of disbelief among those who knew what the house truly represented. For architects, historians, and curators, Dumfries House wasn't simply a building, it was a cultural time capsule, a perfect collision of Palladian design and Enlightenment philosophy, a material essay in proportion, balance, and craft. To see it come apart, not due to disaster, but due to financial arithmetic, felt surreal. Outside, whispers of regret began to circulate. Articles appeared. Conservationists issued final pleas. Some tried to calculate what it would cost to buy the house outright. Others focused on salvaging the contents, proposing last-minute acquisitions or protective loans. But the hour was late, and the mechanisms of the market had already been set in motion. The sense of inevitability was crushing. With each passing day, the house became less of itself. Each item moved, each piece removed, weakened the fragile harmony that had defined Dumfries House since the 1750s. It was like watching a symphony unravel, instrument by instrument, until only echoes remained. And then came the trucks, actual vehicles waiting outside, engines humming. It's one thing to imagine loss, it's another to hear the click of crates being locked shut. The final steps of the process were underway. Objects that had never known another room were now being wrapped in acid-free paper and bubble wrap, tagged not by their meaning, but by their lot number. It was during these final hours, this brink of dispersal, that the house reached its most vulnerable state. Not a ruin, not a restoration project, but something rarer, a masterpiece on the edge of erasure, poised between wholeness and fragmentation. No alarms rang, no crowds protested at the gates. History, it turns out, can vanish in complete silence. But then, at the very moment when the story seemed sealed, something unexpected stirred, and it didn't come from within the house, but from far beyond its grounds. A voice, long associated with tradition and heritage, was about to intervene in a way no one had fully predicted. The house, as it turned out, was not yet ready to say goodbye. Just when the final crate was being sealed, when the house's fate seemed no longer negotiable, an unexpected ripple reached the quiet grounds of Dumfries House. It did not come from a government ministry, nor from a preservation agency, nor even from the local community, many of whom had already braced themselves for the loss. It came instead from a single man, at the time still the Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, and his decision would not only reverse what had seemed irreversible, but alter the trajectory of the estate for generations to come. The prince had long cultivated a reputation for speaking softly where others made noise, for acting on principles often dismissed as sentimental or quixotic. But he was also known for something else, a deep, almost personal commitment to heritage, to craftsmanship, to architecture, as an extension of the human spirit. And it was precisely this constellation of values that made Dumfries House resonate with him at a profound level. When he learned of the house's imminent dismemberment, not through a formal report but through a passionate off-script plea by campaigner James Knox during a conservation conference at the Palace of Holyrood House, it struck a chord that required action, not ceremony. What followed was a demonstration of urgency rarely seen in royal life. The prince, often caricatured for caution or idealism, moved with clarity and speed. He convened meetings, he read through reports, he reached out to private donors, philanthropists, conservation groups, he made calls. And above all, he took a risk, personally and institutionally, by backing the idea that the house could not only be saved, but restored to life as a model of self-sustaining heritage. The plan was bold and unconventional. Instead of simply purchasing the estate through a public body or turning it into a sealed museum, the prince proposed something more ambitious. To preserve Dumfries House not just as an object of nostalgia, but as a living engine of economic and cultural revival. It would be held in trust, yes, but a trust with a mission to create jobs, educate young people in traditional skills, revitalize the surrounding community, and prove that history could be useful, not just decorative. To make that vision possible, money had to appear, and fast. The prince personally authorized a $20 million loan through the Prince's Charities Foundation, placing real financial weight behind his convictions. The Scottish government added $5 million. More came from anonymous donors and partner organizations. In total, an astonishing $45 million was raised in what felt like the final hours. The sale was halted, the trucks were turned around, the objects, some of which had already begun the journey to London, were carefully returned to their rooms. And just like that, the unravelling was reversed. On 27th of June 2007, the announcement was made public. Dumfries House, with all its contents and 2,000 acres of surrounding land, had been secured by a new consortium. The name of the trust, the Great Steward of Scotland's Dumfries House Trust, was more than a poetic gesture. It was a title that the prince himself held as the Scottish heir apparent, linking his intervention to a long tradition of royal stewardship of national heritage. The timing couldn't have been more cinematic. The house had been hours, perhaps days, from permanent fragmentation, and yet here it was, whole again. Not because of a wave of public pressure or a last-minute legislative rescue, but because one person had decided that its disappearance was unacceptable. One person, in the right place at the right moment, with enough credibility, capital, and conviction to tilt the story back from the edge. What made this intervention so remarkable wasn't just that it succeeded, it was the way it reframed the problem. The prince didn't just save Dumfries House, he reimagined its future. He proposed that the house could be more than an artifact, that it could become a campus, a training ground, a visitor destination, a cultural seed planted deep in the soil of Ayrshire. And so, the estate was no longer merely a relic from the past. It became a prototype, a place where history, economy, and community could intersect. And all of it because one man, driven not by nostalgia but by belief, had the imagination to act when the moment called for it. The house had reached its breaking point, and just before the silence became final, it was given back its voice. With the house saved and its future no longer dangling by a thread, the question shifted from survival to purpose. It wasn't enough to keep Dumfries House intact, it needed to be reimagined. The new chapter demanded more than reverence, it required reinvention. And what emerged from this turning point was not a museum encased in glass, nor a retreat frozen in time, but a model of how the past could become a foundation for the future. Under the newly formed Great Steward of Scotland's Dumfries House Trust, a radical idea took root, that heritage could be active, productive, and deeply relevant to the world beyond its gates. The prince's vision was clear. The estate would not become a mausoleum for architecture or an exclusive playground for the elite. It would live. It would work. It would teach. The house, gardens, and surrounding buildings would operate together as a single dynamic ecosystem, part cultural landmark, part educational campus, part rural enterprise hub. History, in this model, was not something to be visited once and admired from behind ropes. It was something to be engaged with, used, and passed on. One of the first steps was to make the house accessible, not simply as a display of 18th century splendour, but as a place where people could come to understand how beauty and craftsmanship once shaped everyday life. Guided tours were introduced, but unlike in traditional stately homes, the emphasis was not on passive observation. Visitors were encouraged to feel the continuity of the space, to see how the furniture, the architecture, and the landscape still functioned as a living whole. It was less about looking back and more about being present. Beyond the main house, the estate began to expand its purpose. Historic outbuildings were restored not just for preservation, but for utility. The old coach house was transformed into a cafe and bistro, becoming a site of hospitality and employment. The stable block found new life as a venue for events and community gatherings. These were not decorative gestures. They were structural decisions aimed at ensuring the estate could generate its own income and reduce dependence on charitable grants. Education became a cornerstone of the new model. Workshops, training programs, and apprenticeships were introduced. Many focused on traditional skills, carpentry, stonemasonry, textiles that had once formed the backbone of British heritage but had faded in the face of industrial modernity. Dumfries House became a place where these crafts could be rediscovered, not in theory, but in practice. Young people from the surrounding regions, many of them from communities facing economic hardship, were invited to participate in hands-on learning, discovering not only skills but a sense of pride and continuity. Agriculture, too, was folded into the estate's purpose. Rather than viewing the land as a decorative extension of the house, the Trust developed sustainable farming projects that could serve as models for ethical food production. With support from partners like the supermarket chain Morrison's, the estate's meat and dairy operations were revived, blending heritage methods with contemporary sustainability goals. The farms became living classrooms, showing how tradition and innovation could coexist in the soil. At the core of all these efforts was a belief that beauty matters, and not just in an aesthetic sense. Dumfries House, in its new incarnation, was an argument for why thoughtful design, harmony with nature, and preservation of craftsmanship were not luxuries, but necessities. These principles weren't locked behind velvet ropes. They were extended outward, to the schoolchildren visiting the estate, to the trainees learning joinery in the converted sawmill, to the elderly residents attending public events in the former stables. The financial model evolved alongside the cultural one. Donations continued, but the estate began generating its own income through a blend of tourism, education, hospitality, and events. The Trust, later absorbed into the broader Prince's Foundation, became a blueprint for how heritage could sustain itself, not by chasing scale or spectacle, but by deepening its roots in the community and offering real-world value. This was not nostalgia. This was not charity for the sake of image. This was regeneration with teeth. A historic house had been pulled back from the brink, and instead of being placed under glass, it was given new hands, new voices, and new life. Dumfries House was no longer simply about what had been saved. It had become about what could be created. The moment Dumfries House reopened its doors in June 2008, it did not feel like the unveiling of a relic. It felt like the reawakening of something that had only been sleeping. The house had survived intact, rescued from the jaws of fragmentation, but its true rebirth began not with press conferences or photo opportunities, but with the slow, deliberate act of restoration. This was not a renovation driven by fashion or profit. It was an effort to return the house not just to its former beauty, but to its former purpose, to allow it to function again as a living, breathing entity. The restoration team worked with a reverence rarely seen in projects of this scale. They didn't just repaint walls, they studied pigments. They didn't just replace broken fixtures, they traced their origins, reconstructed them using traditional methods, and returned them to their exact place. Every decision was made not to update the house, but to realign it with itself. The goal was not reinvention, it was reanimation. Crucially, the Chippendale furniture that had been moments away from auction was returned and restored, not as showpieces in glass cases, but as integral parts of functioning rooms. Visitors would not find velvet ropes or sterile walkways. Instead, they would enter a world that still felt lived in, where history could be touched, felt, and heard in the creak of floorboards or the texture of aged mahogany. The house was not trapped in time, it had carried time with it and now welcomed guests into its continuity. Yet the rebirth of Dumfries House was not limited to its walls. Beyond the main building, the entire estate began to stir. The old coach house, once a crumbling shell, was carefully transformed into a cafe and bistro, not a high-end restaurant for elites, but a welcoming space for families, locals, and tourists alike. Its renovation respected the original architecture while introducing new life into forgotten spaces. It became one of many nodes in the estate's expanding network of restored buildings, repurposed for contemporary use. The estate's former sawmill, powered in earlier times by water and memory, was brought back into operation, not merely as a display, but as a fully functioning building skills centre, where new generations could learn old trades. Here, young people trained in carpentry, masonry, and joinery, using real tools and real timber, guided by craftspeople who saw their work not as nostalgia, but as necessary. In the age of disposable everything, Dumfries House became a place where hands once again shaped materials with care and understanding. One of the most dramatic transformations came with the reclamation of the walled garden. Overgrown, tangled, and long forgotten, it had once been the productive heart of the estate. Clearing it was not an act of erasure, it was an act of rediscovery. As the brambles were removed and the original layout revealed, what emerged was not a perfect replica of a historical garden, but a space reborn with intention. It was renamed the Queen Elizabeth Walled Garden, honouring both continuity and renewal. It bloomed not only with flowers and fruit, but with symbolism, a landscape restored not for aesthetic pleasure alone, but for education, therapy, and community connection. Guest accommodation was added with the same ethos. Rather than building new structures that would clash with the estate's historic fabric, the Trust restored a derelict farm building into Dumfries House Lodge, a 6-bedroom guest house designed to host wedding parties, visiting scholars, and families attending special events. The interior respected the aesthetics of the house without mimicking them, creating a comfortable bridge between past and present. Meanwhile, the estate became a centre for celebration. Events, exhibitions, and gatherings brought thousands to its grounds. Public access was encouraged, not restricted. Dumfries House no longer belonged to one family, but to a larger idea, that heritage, when treated with humility and vision, could serve the public without losing its soul. The restoration did not sterilize the house. It energized it. It allowed people to fall in love with history again, not as something cold or distant, but as something that could host weddings, teach children, train artisans, and feed the land. It proved that authenticity need not be fragile, that you could honor the past without embalming it, that a house, no matter how grand, can have a future if it is allowed to live again. There are houses that are admired, and there are houses that are remembered. But then there are a rare few, like Dumfries House, that evolve into something far beyond architecture. They become symbols, not of power, not of wealth, but of what is possible when care, vision, and timing align against all odds. Dumfries House was never designed to be a monument, and yet, over time, that is what it quietly became, a monument to continuity, to restoration without distortion, to the belief that beauty is not fragile when rooted in purpose. Unlike so many country estates whose stories end in slow decay, ruin, or reinvention under commercial pressures, Dumfries House managed something extraordinary. It kept speaking the same language across centuries. Its proportions still reflect the ideals of the Enlightenment. Its furniture still rests exactly where it was meant to be. Its materials, rooms, and light all continue to perform the quiet symphony conceived in the 1750s, not through isolation, but through integration into modern life. The house never needed to shout to be noticed. It was never the largest, nor the most opulent. What it offered was something far rarer: completion. It was a house that knew exactly what it was from the beginning, and it remained that way not through accident, but through generations of respectful restraint, and finally through the courage to act when it was nearly too late. Now, it stands not just as a beautifully restored estate, but as a working idea. It is studied by architects, historians, and educators, not only for its design, but for its improbable journey. It's visited not only by tourists, but by future craftsmen, by schoolchildren, by international dignitaries who see in its structure a template for what cultural preservation can achieve when it extends beyond sentiment and into action. Through the Prince's Foundation, it continues to evolve, not away from its past, but deeper into it. The estate now hosts courses on heritage building skills, traditional farming, STEM education, and community well-being. Its gardens grow food that is cooked in its kitchens. Its workshops build furniture and tools. Its events raise awareness, not just money. Every part of Dumfries House is used, and in being used, it stays alive. Even the role it plays in the royal narrative adds another layer to its symbolism. It was here, in this house, that Charles III, still the Prince of Wales at the time, was staying in 2022 when he received the call that Queen Elizabeth II was gravely unwell. He departed from Dumfries House by helicopter for Balmoral, leaving a place he had saved to prepare for a role he had spent a lifetime moving toward. In that moment, the house was no longer just a project. It had become a personal sanctuary, a transitional point between service and sovereignty. And yet, Dumfries House resists being finalised. It doesn't close its story with neat endings or dramatic declarations. Its significance continues to unfold, not in grand gestures, but in quiet repetitions. Another apprentice learning to plane wood by hand, another family walking through its gardens, another room lit softly at dusk with the same calm as 2 centuries before. It's a house that proves architecture can hold memory, that furniture can carry intention, and that buildings can become better with time, if time is met with care. It is no longer just a place to visit. It is a place to learn from. There will always be other houses more famous, more photographed, more written about, but few carry the weight of survival so elegantly. Few have come so close to vanishing only to return stronger, wiser, and more open to the future. Dumfries House did not endure by chance. It endured because someone listened at the right moment. And in doing so, it became not just a preserved estate, but a symbol of what can be saved when we act, not after history has been lost, but just before it slips away.